So using the givens in the diagram and facts that we know to be true, we want to write and solve equations to help us find the values for x and y. So when we look at our diagram, a couple of things should stand out. We should see that we have the tick mark showing that line A is parallel to line B. Therefore, we should be able to mark the angles that correspond to each other and that are congruent. So if we take our highlighter, and we'll start with this angle represented by 8x minus 10, its vertical match would be here. We know that they make a linear pair. So 8x minus 10 makes a linear pair with this angle here, and that angle is vertical to this angle here, and they are congruent. Now again, because the lines are parallel, that just means these angles get translated down to these angles here. So this 8x minus 10 gets translated down to this angle, and its vertical pair would be here. This blue angle gets translated down to the 6y plus 20, and its vertical angle is here. So we know based on the color coding that the corresponding angles were congruent, so we have all the congruent angles marked in blue and the other congruent angles marked in yellow. This should help us write some equations to solve for the values of x and y. So if you notice, we have this 8x minus 10. Remember, it got translated down here. 8x minus 10 is vertical now to 7x, so they would be congruent. So I have one equation. I also see that this angle of 6y plus 20 makes a linear pair with the 7x. So remember, the linear pair has a sum of 180. So I have another equation. And of these two equations, if we notice the one here on the left, we could start working on solving for x, and then we can take that value and apply it to our equation on the right to help us solve for y. So on the left-hand side, what could we do to start solving for x? Well, our one option is we could subtract 7x from each, which we would now have x minus 10 equals 0. At this point, we could add 10 to each side, which means x is equal to 10. So if x is equal to 10, I could go to my second equation here and substitute that in where I see x. So we've got 6y plus 20 plus 7 times the value for x, which is 10, equals 180. And continue simplifying the equation and undoing it to solve for y. So we've got 6y plus 20, 7 times 10 is 70, and that equals 180. We've got some like terms here, 20 and 70 to be 90. We can now undo the addition of 90 by subtracting 90 to each side of our equation. So we've got 6y equals 90. All we have to do now is undo the multiplication of 6 by dividing by 6. And now we've got y equals 15. So we have our value for x being 10, we have our value for y being 15. We're not writing these as coordinates because there's a context given to it in terms of angles, and we are going to actually eventually find the angle measurements for problems like this, so we don't want to write it as a coordinate. These are actual values that we're going to use for the angles, so again, that's why we're just listing them separately. So again, for problems like these, using the diagram, look to see if the lines are parallel. If so, mark the corresponding angles that are congruent, the vertical angles that are congruent to help you write some equations. And you can then solve those equations for your two variables and then get the measurements as needed.